Hello, my name is Dr. Ulf Erlingsson and I'm a peace activist in Fuerza de Paz, Venezuela, a voluntary peacekeeping force. I'm here to talk to you about what is going on in Venezuela. You may have noticed on February 23rd there was a big aid concert in Cúcuta in Colombia on the border to Venezuela. And today, March 16, there are marches in the US with the slogan, Hands Off Venezuela. What's going on? Venezuela is in the hands of a criminal regime, a drug cartel regime. It's called Cartel de los Soles in Spanish. Cartel de los Soles. Soles means suns, because the generals in Venezuela have suns on their uniform, depending, what's called stars in the US, they call suns. So it's the cartel, the drug cartel of the generals, a military drug cartel. The head of this drug cartel is Diosdado Cabello. Cabello, two L's. He is also the leader of the regime party, the Socialist Party of Venezuela. Now, before you start thinking that this is a socialist country, it's not. It's a criminal regime, it's a kleptocratic regime. They use the ideology of socialism in order to get the support of poor people. And then they equip these poor people, giving them weapons, giving them money, motorbikes, and telling them to go out and defend the revolution. And they also give them uniforms, military uniforms of Venezuela. And they go out and they do the atrocities that the military and the police refuse to do, because they are trained. They know it's a crime against humanity to do what the regime is asking of these thugs, which are called colectivos. So that's how the regime holds on to power. And the leader of this is Diosdado Cabello. It's not Nicolás Maduro who is the leader of this. Nicolás Maduro is the usurper president, the unconstitutional president, the de facto president of Venezuela. But the actual power resides in the tip of the spear. The one who has the force on his side, the military force, is the one who actually controls it, and that's Diosdado Cabello. Now, next question. Actually, before I go on, there is a humanitarian disaster, because this kleptocratic regime has taken everything in to them. A small group of leaders of this cartel have amassed fortunes in the order of not just millions, not just billions, but trillions of dollars. Whereas the people is living in absolute poverty. They have socialized significant parts of the production of business, of industry, of farms. But they have not done it in order to give it to the people. They have done it in order to use these farms for drug trafficking. They use a big farm, lots of land, where they can land their airplanes and take off and fly the cocaine. So they come in with the cocaine from Colombia. Most of it is produced here in Colombia, what they are forwarding. And then they land on these farms, the huge farms that they have confiscated in Venezuela. And then from there, they fly it out to Central America, Honduras, Mexico, and from there, the Mexican drug cartel takes it over the border into the US. It also goes by boat into the US. The amount of cocaine that they are transporting is tons per day. There are a number of these fincas, farms, and in each one of them, they transport at least 1 ton of cocaine per day. So this is a huge operation. The other things they're doing is gold extraction from the western part of Bolivia, the mining belt, and Amazonas. And there they're destroying the environment, because when you extract the gold, you will use cyanide to get it out, mercury, and I don't know exactly the chemistry, but I know that they are destroying the river Orinoco, which is the second biggest river in South America. It's a tremendous environmental destruction. And the Native Americans, the Indians who live here, are extremely opposed to this, but they can do nothing because this area is controlled by narco guerrilla from Colombia, ELN, and also FARC, dissidents of FARC who never agreed to the so-called peace process. And speaking of the peace process in Colombia, that was a big joke, because what they did actually was, you know, in Colombia there was decades of civil war between guerrilla and then from the right-wing side the paramilitaries. But what's happening now is that the guerrilla in FARC, who after the peace process, and the paramilitary are cooperating in the drug traffic to get the cocaine into Venezuela. So Venezuela is a free land for drug trafficking. That's the hub for all the cocaine trafficking. And I don't know exactly how many tons pass, but maybe let's say 10 tons of cocaine pass per day in Venezuela. And cocaine is worth about double of gold. The allies of the regime they are, most of all, Cuba. Cuba is providing the security services, and they have tens of thousands of people in Venezuela to keep the people on the carpet. And they are cooperating with Nicaragua, but that's mostly for drug trafficking. Nicaragua is another client state. And Bolivia is also doing cocaine production. Evo Morales, you know, they have legal coca cultivation. But what they're doing, Evo Morales is a cocaine producer, because the coca that you chew, medicinal coca, are some bushes, but the bushes that are bitter are the ones you want in case you want to make cocaine. And they are deliberately attacking the medicinal coca in order to grow more bitter coca, to get more cocaine. And a lot of coca disappears from the market in Bolivia, and it's totally clear that that is, instead they're growing bitter coca and they're making cocaine. So that's another of their allies. And the other is Syria, Iran, Russia, and China, and also North Korea. So that's the nature of the regime. And they have totally destroyed the economy in Venezuela. There is a extreme lack of food. There is hyperinflation. You would have to work like 100 jobs to make a decent living. And there's lack of medicines. And there's also, it's not just that there is a lack of it. Whatever is there now is dollarized. Everything is sold and bought in dollars, what's actually going on in the terms of the trade, except in the mining area in Amazonas. There it's gold. You buy and sell everything for gold there, grains of gold. But it's forbidden to use dollars. So that way, they themselves use dollars in the regime, but they forbid it. So if anybody else is doing it, they can confiscate it. It's a complete concentration camp. Venezuela is a huge concentration camp. These are crimes against humanity that have been going on for years in Venezuela. Crimes against humanity, genocide, Holodomor, like the one Stalin did in Ukraine, by not providing food, by denying people, because, as I said, it's not just that they don't provide it. Although they do send in some food baskets for their supporters, for these colectivos from Mexico, which they buy for laundered drug money, by the way, clap. But that's not enough. And if anybody else tries to bring in food, they confiscate it, they prohibit it. And now the border here in Cucuta is closed after 23rd of February. They closed it. So the only way to pass the border is a legal border crossing, where you have to pay, well, you have to pay the people who take you over, and they take a percentage, of course, and that's the guerrilla, it's the military, the Guardia Nacional, National Guard. So nothing is working. People are in an absolutely catastrophic humanitarian situation in Venezuela today. It's catastrophic. Nothing short of catastrophic. This is not a matter of weeks or months until we need a solution here. It's a matter of days. This is a catastrophe going on right now. And now, the reason I'm making this video is because there is a campaign going on called Hands Off Venezuela. But as I've just showed you, the ones who have their hands in Venezuela are Cuba and Russia more than anybody else. They are the ones plundering the country and the drug cartel. So now let's get to the next question. Why doesn't anybody help? Well, first of all, let's look at the people themselves, because the logical step is that the people themselves throw out the government. Venezuela has been electoral dictatorship for 20 years. The elections have been fraudulent, fake, but the opposition has been in cohorts. They have, I don't know the word in English, they have been paid by the regime. And that's how it works in an electoral dictatorship. The opposition makes more money losing than winning. Because in a democracy, politicians in a democracy, they have to provide services to the people to make sure that they get re-elected. That's how the system is supposed to work. But in a dictatorship, the reason they have a dictatorship is because they want to put things in their pockets. And so they need to decrease the expenditures that the regime has. And the way you can hold on to power without providing the services to the people is by spending on two other things: propaganda and repression. When propaganda no longer works, you use repression. And in an electoral dictatorship, you also spend money on election fraud. This you can read in the book from, I think it's 1967, Coup d'etat, a practical handbook. There it explains how it works. How anybody would want to get rich. Look for a country where it's possible to do military coup, take power, use propaganda and repression to decrease the government expenditures and stiff your pockets full. And it has to be a country which is basically an economy based on extraction of natural resources, because then you don't need the people. You don't need a functioning economy. And that is exactly what Venezuela is. They say it's the world's largest oil reserves. I actually don't believe it. I think it's fake in order to borrow money under false pretexts. But no, that's what they say. They have a lot of gold and is tremendously favorable geostrategically because of the cocaine transport. So that's what they did. They took power in Venezuela in order to implement the dictatorship, try to keep people at bay at the lowest cost possible. And the lowest cost, well, that was these colectivos and the propaganda and the electoral dictatorship. Now, look at the opposition politicians. Most, not all, but many opposition politicians have collaborated with this under many years. For instance, in 2006, the opposition united with a single candidate in order to be stronger. That's a good thing, but it opens the door for the dictatorship to bribe only one person instead of many. Manuel Rosales, according to information that has been leaked by a person in his campaign, negotiated and received $300 million in order to lose, even though he had the possibility to win that election. Well, another case, this mining operations down here, extracting gold, coltan, diamonds, etc. Now, when the opposition won 2/3 majority in the parliament a couple of years ago, there were 3 parliamentarians elected from the Native Americans, including from Amazonas. And they did not seat them. The opposition did not seat them in the parliament. And now we know why. Because they made a law against this illegal mining, but they left out important sections of Amazonas and the mining zone where there is a lot of resources. So the opposition clearly made a deal with the regime. So as you see, the opposition is in cohorts. So who's going to get the people free? It has to be the people itself, without relying on the fake opposition, because in a dictatorship, a person who puts up his head and gets identified, the regime can do one of 2 things. They can cut off the head or they can buy him. And if he doesn't allow himself to be bought, they will get rid of him. So visible opposition leaders are no good in this situation. It basically comes down to underground resistance, which is very hard. And now we come to the other thing. The international community has regulated arms trafficking, which means that if the people here wanted to mount an armed struggle, which they do, by the way, they've been wanting to do it for many years, they cannot get weapons, because the only weapons inside of Venezuela is a lot of weapons, but they are in the hands of the regime and criminals. And the criminals mostly have very old weapons, like 50, 100 years old. So the regime has an advantage in terms of firepower in the order of 1,000,000 to 1 or something like that. So it's basically impossible to do an armed struggle. They would be depending on foreign countries to help them. And the international community is totally clear that they're not going to help the people to defend themselves in front of this genocide. There have been other genocides taking place the last 50 years. We had the one in Rwanda, we had the one in Bosnia. And the United Nations found that they don't have the instruments in order to stop that. So the Secretary General of the UN, I believe it was Kofi Annan, told, I don't remember who, speaking from memory now, to go ahead and see if they couldn't create an instrument for that. And they did. And that became responsibility to protect. That was ratified in 2005. So under responsibility to protect, the international community assumes the responsibility to protect a people that is subjected to crimes against humanity or war crimes, and who is not being protected by the government in his country. That's the case in Venezuela. The one who is executing the crimes against humanity is the illegitimate, unconstitutional government, the kleptocratic regime under Nicolás Maduro, where in reality the one holding the power is Diosdado Cabello. And that is why the Venezuelans have been going to the UN, to the OAS, to the US, to the European Union, asking for activation of the responsibility to protect. On February 23rd, there was an aid concert in Cucuta. And before I get to that, let me tell you a joke from Finland. All the jokes from Finland, you have to tell it in a Finnish accent. And the protagonist is always Pekka. So, in this case, Pekka was in a tall building, and there was a fire in the building. And Pekka was screaming from the window, "Help me, help me!" And we were standing below and we were looking at him and we said, "Jump, Pekka, jump! We have a life net, jump!" And Pekka jumped. And we laughed because we didn't have a life net. That's a cruel joke, because he jumped to his death. They raised the hopes in Pekka that he could manage this, and they just tricked him to jump to his own death. Now let me go back to what happened here in Cucuta. There was an aid concert, and the message that they were giving to the Venezuelans was, we are going to get humanitarian aid into Venezuela. Oh, I have to mention Juan Guaido, because Maduro is illegitimate. Then according to the constitution, the Speaker of the Parliament will have to assume the presidency on an interim basis until elections can be held. And Juan Guaido is the Speaker of the Parliament, and therefore he, as interim president, was calling for this. So he was backing this up, and he said, humanitarian help will get in. He asked for humanitarian help. Now, and as you know, the majority of the countries in the developed part of the world have recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president, interim president of Venezuela. So anyway, in Cucuta, right here, they had this aid concert, and they got in a few $1 million. And aid, international aid that came there. And they were going to take it over the border. I think the aid concert was on the 22nd and the 23rd. They were going to take it over the bridges to Venezuela. But the regime, Maduro regime, closed the bridges. They are still closed today. And they did not allow this help to come in. They did the same thing here on the border to Brazil, at Santa Elena. And all these Venezuelans who had come here, because they said Venezuelans have to bring it in. Venezuelan non-governmental organizations and people have to bring the aid in. They're not going to accompany it. Okay, that was the first suspicion, because whenever you send in humanitarian aid against the will of a country, wherever it is in the world, you have to escort it. In this case, we know that if the regime had got it, they would have probably destroyed it, and if not, they would have used it for their own purposes, not given it to the people. So the fact that they were not going to escort it in, but they sold the idea to people. Venezuelans were believing that they were going to escort it. They said, surely Trump is not going to do this. Surely Trump is not going to say that he's going to help us. And Bolsonaro is not going to say all that he's saying if they're not really intending to do it. So the Venezuelans were completely convinced, like Pekka, that there was a life sail there, a life net. But there wasn't. The aid didn't come over, and the Venezuelans who were in Cucuta got stranded. Lots of Venezuelans got stranded because the regime closed the border. And where was the help? All that humanitarian help that supposedly also was stranded in Colombia. Where was it? We in Fuerza de Paz Venezuela, not me personally, but the whole team were there in order to accompany this humanitarian aid. And they also got stranded in Cucuta. And they stayed and made sure that all these Venezuelans got food so that they had something to eat. And they found out that this was all a huge, well, like that Finnish joke. Because the aid wasn't there. It was all a mirage. It was all a Pekka joke. So why is this going on? Why did Trump act so tough on Venezuela? Well, now we have to get into international politics. We who have followed developments in the United States, we know that the Russians meddled in the election here.
Russia, if you're listening.
They did it by supporting Trump, supporting Jill Stein, supporting Bernie Sanders, and opposing very harshly with lies and everything Hillary Clinton. So to me, it seemed illogical that Trump would invade Venezuela when both Trump and Maduro are allies of Putin. However, we have to understand here that Trump is a much bigger asset for Putin than Maduro. Much more important, because this is the #1 country in the world. So if Trump would have been able to invade Venezuela, he would have gained so much prestige that he virtually would have guaranteed his re-election. And that would have benefited Putin, and Maduro would have been somebody he could have sacrificed. Because these people, they use other people. Let me give you an example to show you what I mean. Diosdado Cabello, he had bodyguards working for him in his inner circle for 12 years. And then he decided that they know too much. So he sent colectivos to murder them. There is no retirement plan in the drug cartel that doesn't look like this. A bullet. That's their retirement plan. And that's the retirement plan that Putin had for Maduro and for these people here. Whereas the actual drug cartel, Cartel de los Soles, and Diosdado Cabello, because he's hidden behind. Maduro is the figurehead, but these are behind, and these existed before Chavez came to power. This cartel has existed for decades, and they're cooperating with Cuba and Castro. The drug cartel here that is steered and coordinated from Havana, Cuba, has existed for a very long time. And Cuba and Russia, that's the real strong link. Maduro, they could sacrifice. They could sacrifice the Bolivarian revolution and just continue with the drug trafficking in a new regime. So Maduro was a sacrificial lamb they could have gotten rid of. But what happened? I think they underestimated the degree of resistance to Donald Trump. Because no other country would back this up. Because they realized that by backing up this action with the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump would be to back up the re-election of Donald Trump. And that would have been a bigger risk to world peace than to let the genocide continue in Venezuela. So the real obstacle here is Donald Trump. Therefore, the world did not back this up. The action was called off, and it became this Pekka joke. And what did Putin do next? Well, as I said, dictators have two tools in the toolbox, except the fake elections. Propaganda and repression. Fake elections, propaganda, and repression. So he went to propaganda. And they created this campaign, Hands Off Venezuela. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the explanation why this campaign has been mounted, Hands Off Venezuela. There are solutions to this, but right now there is nobody willing to cooperate, because one thing you can tell about politicians is that they are only thinking about their own re-election, their own party's re-election. They are not thinking as statesmen. They are not thinking in the larger perspective of preserving civilization. And that is the problem we're having in democracies, that democracies are short-term thinking, whereas a dictator like Putin has a long perspective. That is a problem we have.